Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we've got a fantastic watch on the bench. This is a classic Omega Seamaster from the 1950s, which was the golden era for Omega dress watches, and this one checks out all the boxes for a great vintage watch. It's fairly beaten up, looks like it hasn't been touched in a long time, but take a look at that dial. The patina on this thing is just spectacular. The acrylic crystal is cracked, and judging by this noise, there's something loose on the inside, which is not surprising considering it was sold as a non-runner. I picked this one up on eBay and have had it sitting around for a good couple of years, waiting to be repaired. As you can probably tell, I buy more broken watches than anything else, but I got a decent deal here. I paid just under $500 for it, so not too bad. These are not rare watches by any means, but the truth is, a good vintage Seamaster is hard to beat. Problem being that most of the ones being sold for repair are in terrible shape, so let's see what we have here. No engravings on the case back, but we do have them here on the inside. It's written Stay Bright Steel instead of stainless steel, which is interesting. We can see the Omega hallmark and the reference number C2577-1. And here we have one of Omega's famous bumper movements, which is in need of, at the very least, a good cleanup. Well, for starters, take a look at this. The upper bridge screw is loose, so that could very well be the cause of the noise we heard before. That screw belongs to the bridge that holds the rotor in place. And here is the clamp that secures the movement inside the case. As you can see, it's doing a great job. It's stuck there in between the movement and the case, so the easiest thing is to remove the stem first so that we can later flip the case. These Seamasters are the kind of classic watch people often inherited from their father or their grandfather. They became extremely popular during the 50s. If you think about an Omega Seamaster today, you probably think about a diver watch, but it started with dressier watches like this one, which explains why these early references don't have a screw-down crown. My god, we have a lot going on with this dial. We've got super cool arrowhead hour markers, an applied Omega logo, mirror finished gold numerals, and beautiful orange lume plots. Judging by the age of this watch, we're most likely dealing with radium-based lume, which is radioactive, so we have to be careful with it. We don't want to spread any particles around, and it's also a good idea to wear a protective mask. This one doesn't have much lume, and it seems to be more or less intact. Usually military watches with fully lume numerals are more delicate, but still better safe than sorry. We store the hands in a membrane box, which keeps them protected and makes sure the lume doesn't crack or they don't accidentally get bent. Now, we have to separate the dial from the movement, and this hole you see on the side is having a very small screw head, and we should have two of them. That's a hole for the stem, and on the opposite side, well, here we have what looks like a tiny brass spike. That's probably why we don't have a second case clamp, and right here we have the other dial screw. The way dials are usually fixed to the movement is with two small brass feet, and these tiny screws grab them from the side so the dial doesn't move. We don't really need to unscrew them completely, just loosen them enough to release the pressure of the dial feet. Now, with a flat plastic tool, just so we don't scratch the movement, we can slowly separate the two. So far, so good. You can see here the two dial feet and also the negative silhouettes from the hour markers and the logo. All these parts on the dial were manufactured separately, each one with tiny pins underneath and then pressed into the dial. That's what people mean when they talk about an applied logo and applied hour markers instead of having them printed directly onto the dial. We can see a bit of tarnish in the metal surface, and the keyless works looks okay, except for the setting lever spring, which has a black stain on it. The stain is concerning, but what worries me most is this small kink right here, which could cause the spring to break over time. Well, we'll continue disassembling the watch, and for those of you that are new to the channel, thank you for joining. What we're doing here is taking this watch apart down to the very last screw. We'll get everything cleaned and lubricated, and then we'll put it all back together, hoping we can find whatever's broken and bring the watch back to life. We just removed the cannon pinion from the dial side, and we can now continue with the movement side. This is the bridge that was loose. You can see the serial number engraved on it, dating back exactly to the year 1950. And this bridge is part of the automatic bumper mechanism. Okay. We have a few parts working together here under the bridge. We have the pole bearing yoke with a few other parts attached. This is actually my first time working on this movement, as it's usually the case. So we have to figure out how everything works as we go. And here we have the oscillating weight along with its support. The balance wheel seems to spin freely, which is a relief, but let's get it out of the way before we move on with the rest of the automatic mechanism. The balance has an extremely small and delicate spring on it called the Hairspring, and that's the reason it's usually one of the first parts we remove. Best to take it out early, make sure we don't overstretch it. Okay, and store it safely before we continue. We can now work on the lower bridge for the oscillating weight. Here we have a spring that keeps a small lever under tension. Oh, here it is. Everything we've removed so far on this side of the movement, including this bridge, is part of the self-winding module, and the most interesting part of this module are these two springs you can see here. These springs are a crucial part of the automatic bumper mechanism. The rotor moves roughly 120 to 150 degrees with the motion of the wrist and bumps into one of these springs before swinging back the other way. This back and forth movement of the rotor drives the reduction gears and the rest of the parts below to wind up the mainspring. And by the way, they are broken. At least one of them is shorter than it should be, so we'll definitely be replacing those. The funny thing is that when you wear these watches, you can actually feel the rotor bumping against the springs. There are people who dislike these references because of that. For me, it's the opposite. I actually like it because it's quite a unique feeling. You usually put on a watch and forget you're even wearing anything, but with these ones, you're always aware of it. Something else you'll notice in the movements of that era is this very thin pin, okay, which sits on top of this tiny spring. That pin is called the sweep seconds pinion, and it's driven by this wheel, which is friction fitted to the pivot of the third wheel right below the bridge. You can see the pivot sticking out there. This is part of a mechanism you don't really see anymore called indirect center seconds. Remember that before the 40s and well into the 40s as well, most watches had a small sub-seconds dial. So when watchmakers started moving the seconds hand to the center, they did it the way it is here, extending a pivot from the third or fourth wheel to indirectly drive a gear above it, which engages with a sweep seconds pinion where the seconds hand is fitted. The issue with this setup is that the seconds hand tends to flutter, so watchmakers added this support spring to give the second hand a bit more stability. Very dirty crown wheel. You can see it's completely black around the edges, and we also have a lot of buildup around the barrel arbor. The main reason why indirect center seconds isn't really used anymore comes down to reliability. So the seconds hand has to move very precisely, and when it's driven by several very light parts interacting through friction, torque transmission can become very inconsistent. especially over time, is wear and poor lubrication come into play. We can now... wait a minute. I just found this little piece of spring laying here. You probably spotted this a while ago, so sorry if you've been screaming at your screen. That's weird. My guess is that the watch took a pretty big hit at some point. Maybe it fell off or something. Because I'd imagine these springs were tested pretty extensively by Omega, especially if they're meant to be constantly absorbing the impact of the oscillating weight. The case looks good though, so I don't know. Okay, the bridge comes off, and underneath we can see the train of wheels that connects the barrel with the pallet fork. And this one here is the barrel bridge. There we go. Okay. Oh, with even more of that old grease underneath. We can now start disassembling the train of wheels. That's the second wheel, the third wheel, the fourth wheel, and the smallest one here, which is the escape wheel. Okay, and this here is the barrel. Really looking forward to opening it, but let's finish here first. These are the winding pinion and the sliding pinion, also called the clutch wheel. As you saw, they were both stuck together, again because of that old grease that was supposed to act as a lubricant, and now it's just keeping everything stuck. Okay, let's take out the pallet cock. Oh, a bit more aggressive than expected. Hope the pivots are fine, but we'll check all of them under the microscope anyway to make sure they're okay. With age, the wheel pivots can also get worn out. Time to finish up with the keyless works on the dial side, and I'm really curious about the setting lever spring. It almost looks like an old tape stain on top of it, but it's also bent right in the middle section of the spring, which makes me think this could be some kind of previous repair from the person that serviced the movement before. There's also a stain here on the side of the movement that looks a lot like glue. We'll see once we inspect each part properly if there's anything that looks suspicious, because if something has been glued, the chemicals in the cleaning machine could very well dissolve it. We push back the yoke spring to take the yoke out. Very carefully, because that's quite a strong spring and it can fly off at any moment if I don't hold it properly. There you go. What's left here are the cap jewel setting, these two screws for the banking stop, and of course the setting lever, which, as you can see, is actually held in place from the other side by the setting lever screw. That's the screw that you need to loosen if you want to release the stem, and if you unscrew it completely, it will release the setting lever as well. So if you ever accidentally pull the stem out of your watch and think about fixing it yourself, that's the screw you're looking for. Just keep in mind, you'll need a very small screwdriver, so if you don't have the right tools, I'd suggest just taking it to your local watchmaker. They might not even charge you for something like that. And here we have the banking stop, which is the little bridge that holds those two banking springs in place. Let's take out the screws as well. 1 and 2. And here we finally have the empty main plate. As you can imagine, the bumper movement isn't the most efficient automatic mechanism. It's much better to have a rotor that can spin the full 360 degrees, and Omega certainly had the engineering talent to do that at the time. So why didn't they? Well, the bumper system goes back to John Harwood, a British watchmaker in the 1920s, and by the 1940s it had already been refined and fully industrialized, so manufacturers could produce it easily at scale. The other reason is that Rolex held the patents covering a 360 degrees rotor, which likely blocked other brands from developing their own. The last spring left from the automatic mechanism is out, and there's something on this bridge that really shouldn't be here. It'll be easier to spot under the microscope, so take a closer look at that center jewel. What you're seeing here is a broken pivot, and that's definitely the reason why the rotor was loose. It also lines up with the theory of the watch receiving some kind of hit at some point. Now, that broken pivot has to come from this silver part right here underneath the rotor. So let's take a look. If I can grab it. Yep, there it is. So this is the upper side, covered in oil, by the way, and this is the back side. You can clearly see where the pivot snapped. The balance staff pivots are protected by the Inca block system, which is a shock protection mechanism, because those are the thinnest pivots in the movement. The rest of the pivots, though, are pretty much exposed when it comes to impacts, and if the watch takes a fall, that's what happens. They can break quite easily. This one here is basically the last part left to disassemble, apart from taking the mainspring out of the barrel, and is also part of the automatic works. John Harwood's original mechanism was much simpler, as you can imagine, and didn't have nearly as many parts as what we're seeing here, which makes sense considering Harwood's was made 30 years prior. These screws are really, really small and, oh wow, very tight as well. I have to use my finger. Okay. This Omega 351, which is the caliber in our watch, is a much more refined version of the bumper automatic mechanism with many added components to improve efficiency and reliability. This caliber was actually one of the very last bumper movements Omega made. After this, there was caliber 354, which came out in 1952 with very minor changes. And after that, in 1955, Omega finally introduced the caliber 500, which was the first movement with a 360-degree rotor. Time to start with the case. First up, we have to take out this old crystal. Uh-oh. This thing is literally falling apart. Whew. Good. These acrylic plastics don't age very well, and this one is an armored crystal, meaning it has this metal tension ring that keeps it in place, which is broken as well. Wow, look at this. Anyway, the case itself is looking a lot better than the crystal. It's hard to tell if it's been polished before, but still looks pretty sharp to me. And we have the rubber gasket here stuck to the inside of the case. Rubber also tends to get brittle with time, and you can see it here. It's really hard to get these old gaskets out in one piece. Oh, and I'm seeing we have a fair bit of rust underneath the rubber gasket. These gaskets are usually replaced at every service to prevent the rubber from drying out and to keep water resistance. Okay. And finally, there we go. Managed to remove the last piece. Let's take a closer look at this rust under the microscope and see how bad it really is. This is just some dirt we have on the inside of the lugs. And here is where we have the accumulated rust. Okay, looks like it's only superficial and we can remove it pretty easily with the stick. These are pegwood sticks, and they're one of the essential tools in watchmaking and also one of the few cheap ones. Pegwood is soft enough to not scratch the metal, but still hard enough to remove dirt like this. You just have to sharpen it every now and then, and they're super handy because you can shape them however you need to get into all the little nooks and crannies of a watch case. The ultrasonic bath is pretty good at removing oil and dirt, but this hardened residue in between the lugs won't come off so easily. So before we even get to the chemical cleaning, it's always good to do a first pass by hand to remove the more stubborn stuff. Okay, I think that's good enough for now, and we'll have to do the same here for the case back. Oh God. These slots are made for a case opener tool. They're designed to fit metal pins that lock into these squares to help tighten or loosen the case back. But as you can see, they also get filled up with dirt, even just from daily wear. Now, the power source of the watch is the mainspring, which is a very long, powerful spring that's fitted inside the barrel. There it is. The barrel arbor is placed at the center so the mainspring can coil around it. There you go. Oh, well, there's something else to add to the list of broken parts. The mainspring snapped right at the inner coil, and we just found out the reason why we couldn't get the watch running. The mainspring obviously has to be in one piece, otherwise it can't coil properly or store any energy. In the late 40s and early 50s, these were typically made out of carbon steel, which is very dark, almost black or slightly bluish. This is not one of them, which means the mainspring was replaced during a previous service for a more modern mainspring. This is how it should look. Hardened carbon steel was basically the only material used for mainsprings for hundreds of years, but it has two main issues. The first one is that it's hard but also brittle, so it tends to snap. As you can see, even the newer ones can break if they're not replaced from time to time. The second issue is that carbon steel springs tend to set over time. They're not very elastic, so they slowly deform and become weak, or tired as it's often referred to, especially after years of use, which directly affects the balance amplitude and, in the end, the timekeeping of the watch. We've got all the parts inside the cleaning baskets, and now it's time to let the watch cleaning machine do its thing. So this is my vintage Elma cleaning machine, and it has two different solutions specially made for cleaning watch movements. The first one is the cleaning solution, which breaks down and dissolves oil, greases and dirt. In this machine I can increase the basket speed, and 5 minutes or less is usually more than enough. What's important if you want to preserve the solvents as long as possible is to remove as much excess liquid as you can, because next we'll dip the parts into a rinsing solution to wash out the cleaning solution itself, along with all the loosened residue before everything goes into the heater. The largest parts, including case and crown, go in a heated ultrasonic bath for about 15 minutes. And here we have all the parts after the cleaning. Everything's looking super shiny except for our friend here, the setting lever spring, which somehow looks just as awful as it did at the beginning. I have absolutely no clue what's going on here. It's full of scratches. I can see at least 3 different colors. Something weird's going on over here, and it's also full of dents along the thinner section of the spring. I mean, just look at this thing. So anyway, I've decided to scrap this one and look for a replacement. Let's place the different oils in our oiler. This one's called D5, and we'll use that for slower moving, higher load parts. Here we have one called 9010, a synthetic oil for fast moving pivots and capsules. This one coming out of a syringe is called 9501, and it's used for high friction, high torque parts. And finally 9415, used for the pallet jewels. Perfect. We can now start with the movement assembly, and the first thing will be our new mainspring. For this we have to first apply braking grease, which is much thicker than any of the oils I showed you before, and this one goes here on the inside walls of the barrel. The reason is that the mainspring, which you can see here, will be constantly coiling and uncoiling inside the barrel, which means a lot of metal on metal friction and without grease it would wear down and create metal shavings over time. New mainsprings come pre-coiled and already lubricated, otherwise we'd have to use another grease for that. This one is made out of a modern alloy called Nivaflex, which is mainly a blend of cobalt, nickel, and chromium, and it has much better mechanical properties than the old carbon steel mainsprings. I'll leave a link down below in the video description that explains how modern mainsprings are made, which is quite a cool process in case you're interested. Okay, now that we've pressed it in place, we can try to fit the arbor back in the center. Good. As I mentioned before, the mainspring coils around the arbor when the watch is wound, so there's a little hook right here that needs to catch into this slot. To do that, we just spin the arbor slowly until it clicks into place. There you go. Great. Placing a new mainspring is always a little nerve-wracking for me, especially the ones that come pre-coiled. I'm always a little bit worried that it might explode out of the holder when I slide it into the barrel, which happened before. But thankfully not this time, and the barrel lid is now on. We just have to double check that it's properly closed all the way around, and it looks good. I left the balance assembled in the movement during the cleaning because the hairspring is so delicate that it could easily get damaged if it was loose in the baskets. And while we work on the rest, we can place it in this holder so it's safe and out of the way. The train of wheels is usually a good place to start assembling your movement, but in this case I'll install first the banking stop because, as you remember, it's screwed in from the other side. Most likely so that if these two screws ever came loose, they wouldn't be on the way of the rotor hitting the springs. After disassembling the first few movements, you start to realize that there's a reason behind every detail, even when it comes to screw placement. Okay, now we can go ahead with the barrel, and then we start the train of wheels with the escape wheel. Okay, next we have the fourth wheel. This part takes a bit of patience because we have to make sure that the wheel pivots drop cleanly into their jewels and that the wheels themselves are sitting perfectly straight, since the bridge has to go on top, and all those pivots will only pass through the upper jewels if they're properly centered. Okay, this is the third wheel with that extended pivot, and the last one is the second wheel. That thicker pivot is where the cannon pinion fits on the other side of the movement. Now the moment of truth. Let's see if the bridge goes on easily. We can't apply too much pressure here, or we risk snapping a pivot. Okay. There it goes. Just fell into place. Let's check. What we're looking for is that little silver pivot at the center of each jewel. Okay. That's the extended pivot. And now, if we spin the barrel, there you go. All the wheels are spinning freely, which means we can continue. Everything is looking great. It's actually kind of amazing that a movement that's more than 70 years old still looks this good, and that really says a lot about the build quality of these watches. You have to remember that Omega delivered huge quantities of military watches to the British Ministry of Defense during World War II, and those watches already had to be water resistant and anti-magnetic to a certain extent. So by the early 50s, the brand already had a lot of experience in building tough and reliable watches. The Seamaster models were the first ones to use rubber gaskets instead of the lead gaskets found in earlier military models. And up until 1957, the entire Seamaster line consisted of what we'd probably consider dress watches these days. At the time, though, they were marketed as sports watches or all-rounders. A small drop of oil on the edge of the crown wheel, and now the core goes in. Here we just want to make sure that the screw holes are properly aligned before we continue with the click and ratchet wheel. You can see that the outer ring of the crown wheel is silver colored, just like the click and the ratchet wheel, while the bridges have this beautiful pinkish tone typical of these vintage Omega movements. That's not by accident. The parts that are constantly engaging and working under higher torque, like these two wheels, are made of hardened steel to make them more resistant to wear over time. We lubricate the barrel arbor. Okay. And now we can put the click spring back in place. Perfect. So I was looking through some old Seamaster ads, and there really aren't many left, just a handful online that watch enthusiasts have found and were kind enough to scan. But you can see how Omega was heavily promoting these early models as sturdy, water-resistant sports watches, quote-unquote, made for a life of action. Something really interesting in that ad is, well, first of all, the price. This one in steel was £49 at the time, which is about $140. Not sure how much would that be adjusted for inflation. But anyway, what caught my attention is that it specifically mentions the case being made out of stay bright steel, which, if you remember, is exactly what we saw engraved on our caseback. Okay, the ratchet wheel is now in place. I just need to block it for a second to make sure the screw is fully tight. And there's a little speck of dust. Perfect. And before we get into what in the world stay bright steel actually is, let's oil the jewels. Here we're using one of the lighter, less viscous oils, and you can see that the jewels are slightly concave at the top to direct the oil towards the pivots. Okay, now let me show you something cool. These are the old sliding pinion and winding pinion. When you put them together, you can see just how worn these parts are. What can happen if we keep this in is that at some point when you turn the crown, they start slipping over each other and it becomes impossible to wind the watch. These here are the new ones, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Just look at how sharp the teeth are, and when they're together you can see there's no gap at all between the parts. That's what years of use does to the keyless works, and it's exactly why bringing a watch in for service every 5 to 10 years or so is a really good idea. Going back to what I was saying earlier, it turns out that Stay Bright was a trademark for a specific stainless steel alloy that was developed in England in the 1920s by William Hatfield and was later offered to Swiss case makers in the 1930s. Before that, watch cases were usually made from nickel-plated brass, silver, or gold. Steel was used as well, but it was carbon steel, which wasn't really suitable for exposed parts because it was prone to rust. Then nickel plating eventually wears through, silver tarnishes, and gold is a relatively soft metal, so Stay Bright Steel solved all those problems at once. The reason Stay Bright was so effective is that it contains much more chromium than carbon steel. This allows a thin chromium oxide layer to form on the surface, and that protects the metal from corrosion. It took case makers a bit of time to learn how to properly work with this material, but once they did, many watch brands adopted it, including Omega, Rolex, JLC, and many others. Stay-Right is essentially what we know today as 304 stainless steel. Let's place the yoke back in its post and let the upper part rest in the middle of the sliding pinion. As you can see, I'm using the same grease everywhere here in the keyless works. That's because this is a grease that's viscous enough to stay in place where we apply it and not wander into other parts of the movement. And it's also the right one for parts with higher torque that are only moving every now and then. The parts here in this section of the keyless works will only move when we change the position of the crown in or out. It's not like, for example, the pivots we oiled earlier in the train of wheels, which are constantly spinning. The intermediate wheel goes in, and now I can show you the new setting lever spring, which is looking much better compared to the one we originally had in here. The old one was working fine up until now, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel right to have such a clean movement and leave in parts that could fail in the near future. We'll now make the spring engage with the greased setting lever. And there we go. And these two little notches you can see are there to lock the setting lever in different positions when we set the time or wind up the movement. This is the driving wheel that goes pressure fitted onto the extended pivot of the third wheel. And that's part of the indirect center seconds mechanism. Okay. And here we have the sweep seconds pinion that it engages with. And the leaves of the pinion are resting right on top of the friction spring. The tricky bit here is placing a really tiny drop of oil, in this case the thinnest oil I have, right on top of it. Great. And this is how we secure it in place with the sweep second cock, which is like a small bridge. And oh, wow, looks like the bridge underneath still had a bit of room to settle over the post on the main plate. It might look like there's a screw missing on the thinner section of the train of wheels bridge, but that's actually because there's another bridge from the automatic works that sits right on top of it, and they both screw together at that spot. It's always easier to put the pallet fork in place under the microscope. You can see the two pallet stones. If I manage to place the bridge correctly, which the pallet stones act as a kind of locking and releasing mechanism. The pallet fork is the part that controls all the power coming down from the mainspring, and it's constantly ticking back and forth. Since it's in constant contact with the escape wheel, there needs to be a ruby on both ends to reduce the wear to a minimum, and they need to be lubricated as well. We can now wind up the mainspring. And as you can see, the pallet fork starts bouncing back and forth because of the stored energy that gets released momentarily when we move the other end. Well, time to put the balance back into the movement, but first we want to make sure the hairspring is free of dust and oils, so we submerge the balance in a special solvent called B-dip and give it a bit of agitation. This is formulated to evaporate very quickly when it comes in contact with air, and it does not dissolve the shellac on the impulse joule, which is very important. As some of you may know, I've made that mistake before. It also leaves a very thin protective layer that helps prevent moisture or corrosion on the hairspring. Let's see. Maybe it just needs a little bit of help to get going. Well, that's weird. Let's take a closer look. Oh, no. Oh, look at this. The hairspring should be perfectly flat under the balance cock, and you can see it's not sitting right. That's weird because I remember checking the balance before the cleaning, and it was spinning freely without any issues. Anyway, we have to take the hairspring apart to check for any signs of damage, so we loosen this screw first, and then open the regulator here to release it. You'll have to forgive me for this bit, but I couldn't get that on camera. I just didn't want to risk any extra damage to the hairspring with the tweezers. Here we have it from the side, and it doesn't look as bad as I thought, but you can see that roughly around here the spring starts to bend upwards. And when we lay it flat, this section towards the end is completely twisted, which is what's causing the whole thing to sit sideways. So the question is, how did this happen? And I think I have the answer. It turns out that the spike I was using to hold the balance during assembly is actually a terrible place to leave it. If it hangs there long enough, the weight of the wheel stretches and deforms a hairspring. So another lesson learned the hard way. Anyway, to fix this, I'll have to manually correct the hairspring twist with a pair of tweezers, and I need to be extremely careful doing this. Mainspring manipulation is pretty much every watch repair hobbyist's nightmare. What I'm trying to do here is to identify where the twist starts, and with very small movements, correct the shape bit by bit. Now, since I'm using a binocular microscope with a phone mount, showing this on camera would mean looking through the phone screen instead of the eyepieces, and I'm afraid I'll make things worse, so I'll have to show you the front view while I fix it. And after about half an hour adjusting the hairspring, you can see here the end result. I managed to remove the twist with a bit of patience, and now we just have to place it back on the balance cock to see how it behaves. The stud is already secured, and this time I'll try to show you how I close the regulator. It's quite tricky to turn. It's not only tiny, but also surprisingly stiff. Okay, there we go. I've ruined my fair share of hairsprings while practicing when I started with the hobby, and it's definitely not something I'm comfortable with yet. I honestly wonder if trained watchmakers ever get fully comfortable with this, because it's such a tricky thing to do, and the smallest mistake can leave the hairspring completely unusable. Oh, look at that. Whew, that's quite a relief. We still have to check the accuracy on the time grapher, but as you can see, the balance is spinning freely, and just visually, the amplitude already looks quite good. The amplitude refers to how far the balance wheel swings back and forth, and it's one of the key indicators of a movement's health. Okay, the spring is looking much better now. You can see that it's parallel, or at least mostly parallel to the balance cock. And here's a comparison shot between before and after the repair. In the upper image, the spring was sitting so low that it was actually touching the plate and preventing the balance from spinning. Time to clean up the cap jewels. These are the jewels that protect the balance staff, and there's two on each side of the movement, held on by this little spring that I just opened. The reason why there's two jewels stacked on top of each other is because this is a shock absorber system. This one you see is a lower jewel with a brass holder, and we have to clean everything with B-dip, which is the same solvent we used for the hairspring. There are many different types of shock absorbers in watchmaking. This one's called Inca block, and it has basically 3 parts to it. First, we have the balance staff jewel, which is the one you saw earlier with a hole in the center, and that's fitted inside a brass holder called the chaton. On top of that one sits the cap jewel, which is the one I'm trying to grab here. It has one flat side, which is where we place the oil. Okay, perfect. This jewel is smaller, and as you can see, it doesn't have a hole in it. Now we simply place the 2 jewels together, just like that. You can see they stick together because of the oil between them. And yeah, now we can just go back to the balance. We place both jewels back in position. So the balance staff passes through the hole in the first jewel and reaches the oil. And holding everything in place, we have the third part of the system, which is the anti-shock spring. I'll put a link down below in the video description to an article that shows an animation of how this system works, but in broad terms, apart from holding the lubrication, it leaves a bit of room for the balance staff to bounce up and down and a bit to the sides, so that if the watch gets dropped, the staff can absorb the shock and the pivots don't break. Before we continue assembling the automatic works, let's take a look at the timekeeping. Well, not too bad. The rate is way off, but the amplitude, which was my main concern, is quite strong at around 260 degrees, and the bit error is fantastic. Now, to correct the rate, we can move the regulator index very slightly towards the A. A stands for avance in French, which means advance, and makes the watch run faster. Let's see. Okay, that's better. We were losing 99 seconds per day, and now we are at 75 seconds, which means that we need to keep moving the index. What this actually does is move the regulator pins, which shortens the effective length of the hairspring. A shorter hairspring is stiffer and makes the balance oscillate faster. And we nailed it. We are at 8 seconds per day, 1 second per day, wow. That's excellent. Even the amplitude is picking up now at around 270 degrees, so we are done here regulating the movement. We can now finally start assembling the automatic mechanism. This is the old banking stop spring, the one I initially thought was in one piece, and here we have the 2 new ones I got after realizing that actually both of the original ones were broken. It's important that we have the full length of the spring so that the oscillating weight can properly bounce off them. Such a cool automatic mechanism design. It's a shame these are not being produced anymore. Omega stopped making bumper movements, also called hammer automatic movements, by the end of the 1950s. It's true that they're less efficient in terms of winding the mainspring, and that watches tend to be a bit thicker because the movement itself is quite tall. But nonetheless, there is something special about this design, and I think if you're into vintage watches, one of these is definitely a must-have. And it was not only Omega using them. You can find bumper mechanisms from JLC, Universal Genève, Movado, Midot, Longines, and many other brands. Even movement manufacturers like ETA were producing them for other brands. We screw the stop-click spring in place. There you go. And also the bridge, which I almost forgot. This one's a bit different. It only has one screw here at the lower end because there will be yet another bridge coming on top. Now, the stop-click spring engages with this part here, that's the stop-click, and will grease the contact points between the two. Almost all points where we have metal-on-metal contact have to be lubricated. if not all. But, well, except for the teeth on the wheels in the gear train, motion works and keyless works. That's because properly designed gears roll against each other instead of sliding, so there is already very little friction. Also, oil will allow contaminants to accumulate between the teeth, where it will harden and cause even more wear in the long run. Let's test the click. Perfect. Okay, so far we found a broken mainspring, a broken pivot, both banking stop springs were broken, the setting lever spring was damaged, I bent the hairspring, and if that wasn't enough, have a closer look in here. You see this little post? We should have 2 of them. The second one I found at the bottom of one of the cleaning baskets. It should go right here. I'm not even sure how these posts are originally attached to the movement. It's the first time I've seen one detached like that, and I honestly didn't even know this could happen. So to reattach it, we're gonna use some fast drying glue. I'm not usually a fan of gluing things inside watch movements, but in this case, we'll make an exception because I don't really know how to do it otherwise. We use an old oiler to carefully apply some glue inside the hole. Just a little bit. We don't want the glue to overflow once we put the post in. And this seems to be pressure fitted. Let me see. Okay. I think I'll give it a try with the flat side of our plastic tool. Okay, let's have a closer look. This one is the one that was intact. And here's the one that we just put back in place. I'd say pretty much at the same height. So yeah, great. That worked out pretty well. We'll let it dry for a few minutes while we go ahead with the ball bearing yoke, which is the part that transmits the motion from the rotor to the crown wheel. This is the driving wheel. Oh, wait, I'm forgetting something here. We were missing the impulse click. You can see that we have a built-in spring here, and that spring should rest against the side of the click. You'll see why in a second, if I manage to screw it in place. Okay. Now, perfect. There you go. Okay, now the spring is doing what it's supposed to do, which is creating the tension to push the click inward and keep it engaged with the driving gear. Just like that. And now we can screw it onto the core underneath so that everything gets sandwiched together in one piece. You can see that the driving gear has asymmetrical teeth, kind of inclined in one direction, because while the rotor is spinning back and forth, the 2 clicks, so this one and the one we installed on the bridge, take turns to catch it and release it while it spins. The asymmetrical tooth shape helps the click engage properly and make sure it only spins in one direction. Okay, here we have the oscillating weight and the new support. If you remember, that's the one that had the broken pivot, and they managed to find an original part from Omega, which isn't always easy. Omega and most watch brands have been changing their policies over the years in terms of part supply. These days, they only sell parts to certified watchmakers or service centers, which means that as a hobbyist, you can't get the parts directly from the manufacturer anymore, and they end up being a lot more expensive if you can find them at all. You can instead use generic parts that are a lot cheaper, and to be honest, I'm not even sure how big the difference in quality actually is, but I prefer to use original part if I can. You can see more engravings on the top of the oscillating weight. It says Omega Watch Co., Swiss, and 17 joules. That's the total number of synthetic rubies that are used in this movement, which is pretty much the sweet spot for an automatic watch like this without a date function. Okay, let's take this out. And that looks perfect. Time to finish up assembling the rest of the automatic works where we left it. First, we place the assembled ball bearing yoke so that the leaves on the pinion underneath are engaged with the crown wheel. Now, the end of the ball bearing yoke, like we talked about earlier, is meshing with the oscillating weight. So when the oscillating weight moves back and forth, the motion gets transferred through the ball bearing yoke all the way down to the mainspring. It's honestly hard to believe how someone could even come up with all these mechanisms. Especially when you see the amount of watch complications there are, it's just really impressive. Even these days, movement designers and watchmakers are still coming up with new ideas, new materials, new ways of doing things. It's really, I'll read an article about new complication and end up going over it 10 times just to wrap my head around it. Okay, to finish things off, we screw down the upper bridge. Let's make sure those are tight this time and take a look at how the click works while I check the rotor. We are almost there. Let's oil the last pivots. And I can't wait to put everything back together. It's really satisfying to repair something that's been broken for so long, especially such a nice watch that, I don't know, I'd like to think meant a lot to its owner. Who knows, maybe it was his first watch or a birthday present or a wedding gift. We'll never know, but if this watch could talk, I'm sure it would have a few stories to tell. We can finally place the dial back. Some of you might be thinking, why don't I try to clean it? And that can seem quite obvious, right? You see these stains on the dial, and the natural instinct is to want to remove them and end up with a more uniform surface. But to me, that's the best part of vintage watches. Every dial ends up looking a bit different, even when they came out identical from factory, and the stains or color changes over time is what people call patina. It's associated with aging of the varnish, the paint, the lume, and so on, and it's not something you can really clean off. In fact, if I tried, I would completely ruin the dial, and in my opinion, the whole watch. These details are part of the story the watch tells. When it was made, how it was stored, how much it was worn, how it was treated, and that's something I think it's always worth keeping. We'll start placing the hands, and the bottom one is always the hour hand. These Omega Seamaster references have aged beautifully, and if you take a look online, you'll find some really cool pieces with all kinds of dials and case variations. I'll also put a link down below to the Omega forums page on the 2577 reference. That's definitely worth a read. I want to make sure that the hand is not touching the applied logo. Otherwise, if the hand gets blocked, the watch will stop. Okay. We were saying before that up until 1957, Seamaster watches looked like this one here, but from that year onwards, the Seamaster line changed completely. In 1957, Omega introduced what they called the trilogy, which was the Speedmaster, the Railmaster, and the Seamaster 300. These models became iconic for the brand, and from then the Seamaster line evolved towards professional diver watches. They kept making dressier watches, also Seamaster models, but those were renamed as Seamaster de Ville, de Ville meaning for the city in French. The sweep seconds hand starts ticking as soon as we place it, and now we just need to fit it inside the sweep seconds pinion. Great, and we're done with the hands. One last check to make sure everything rotates freely. The last thing we want is to find out something's wrong once it's already in the case. Here we have the case after the ultrasonic cleaner. No signs of rust or dirt left. And same thing with the case back. Beautiful. I got a new armor crystal for this watch. As you might remember, the old one was basically unusable, and this one's going to make a huge difference to how the watch looks. Now, armor crystals are installed in a very specific way. We have a couple of different dies that will go on the press. The first one is the lower die. This one will be the support for the case, and it should fit inside it without much play. This one's perfect. The next one is the upper die, and this one has the same curved shape as the crystal. I like that the edge of the die is sitting right where the curve of the crystal begins. It needs to be the right size because when pressure is applied on the crystal's edge, it will slightly reduce its diameter and make it snap into the case. These crystals are made out of plexiglass, which is quite flexible. Usually, the ones without the armor ring, you can just slide them into the case and let them expand. But the one we have here can only bend a tiny, tiny bit because the metal ring is holding its shape from the inside. So we have to pressure fit it instead. I'm going to put this soft cloth in between to make sure it doesn't get scratched. And once everything is centered, we can lower the press. There you go. That's what we want to hear. That was the crystal snapping into the case. Okay. And what a difference does a new crystal make. This looks really, really good, and it's perfectly in place. Luckily, I was able to measure the old one, so I didn't have to order a bunch of different sizes this time. And one thing I've learned over the years is how easily dust gets trapped between the dial and the crystal. Compressed air works great if you have it, but since I don't, these plastic sticks with a sticky rubber tip are a lifesaver. Let's take the stem out of the way so we can fit the movement inside the case. Okay. We had the brass spike sticking out somewhere. This side seems in place. Ah, there it is. We just have to make sure it's properly lodged on the inside so that the movement is secured and it doesn't rattle around inside the case. And it looks like I won't be able to do it unless I lift it slightly from the other side and slide it in. Okay, perfect. And then the other end gets secured with a case clamp. You can see that there's a cutout on the upper bridge. I'm not entirely sure why it's there. It could be to leave some room for the click because it sticks out a bit. Or, I don't know, maybe to make lubrication easier. Either way, if you know the reason, feel free to let me know in the comments. Something that usually gets replaced at every service are the rubber gaskets. This is a lubricating box that has these blue pads soaked in grease just to make the job easier. Rubber gaskets were a big step forward to improve water resistance in watches. Before that, manufacturers used all kinds of materials like leather, cork, or even lead. The problem is that all those materials mainly kept dust out, but they didn't do a great job against water or moisture ingress. And as you can imagine, they didn't hold up very well with repeated opening and closing of the case back. So from around the mid to late 40s, rubber gaskets started to become standard and water resistance improved dramatically. The only thing is that you need to lubricate these gaskets, otherwise they will dry out and crack over time. The case clamp is in place, and now once we screw it, it will start pressing against the case and push the movement down. Alright, time to finally close it up. This one's been quite a journey. We had to repair a lot more than I expected, but I've always wanted to work on one of these beefy lug Seamasters. That's what enthusiasts call these 1950s Omega references with the thicker lugs. This watch is only 35mm, but the case design makes it look a lot larger. And if you pair it with dials like this one, it really doesn't get much better. Let's wind it up a bit and try to set the hands, just to make sure everything's working correctly. Perfect. And before I start staring at this thing all over again, let's finish the job with a leather strap. I tend to like warmer colors on straps, beige, brown, things like that, rather than black. Otherwise it feels a bit too dressy for me. These Seamaster models also came with the famous Beads of Rice bracelets from Omega, if you ask the retailer for it. Hands down, one of the better looking vintage bracelets out there. Although I think a leather strap was the standard option back in the 50s for these references. And here we have the end result. This is, without a doubt, my definition of a great vintage watch, and it really reminds me why I love doing this so much. I hope you enjoyed the restoration as much as I did. Thanks for sticking around until the end. I know this was a long one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.